Thanks, Mike, and thank you, PK, for the invitation. It's great to be back. My discussion will be different in a few ways, one of which is you'll note here that I'm the only one in the session here that takes care of slightly smaller patients. And one might think perhaps the reason to talk about, to invite a pediatric specialist to talk about retrievals is that those guys have no idea what they're doing and they're losing devices constantly. But I think if you have anyone in your facility who's a pediatric interventionalist who is over the age of 40, those are good individuals to get to know because really, for the majority of my career, we did not have devices that were actually designed for the purpose that we're taking kids to the cath lab. And so very early on, we had to go fishing quite frequently for devices. So if you're ever in a bind, those are good people to know. The other thing that's a little bit different about my talk is that, unlike the last speaker who was very brave to talk about his own mishaps and how he got out of it, I've decided to talk about my colleagues' mishaps and how I helped them get out of it. Not quite as bold, perhaps. PK asked me to talk about retrievals and assigned me this title. And being a pediatrician, I just assumed that this is what he meant. Here in the pediatric realm, we tend to talk about this a lot. The only thing I have to disclose is that I do direct a course for Abbott Medical, and I will be discussing some of their products. One of the things I explained, I talked a little bit about device retrieval on some different cases yesterday for the fellows course. And one of the things I explained to this stuff happens to all of us. And when they're early in their career, they need to understand that this happens. And they'll have to also understand that the difference between now and then is that later in their career, when they're the big dog, they have to learn how to be able to clean up after the mistakes that they made. And that's really what this is about. This is the first case that we're going to talk about. And I think this is particularly relevant now that the PFO devices are FDA approved and PFO closure is going to be once again more common. This is actually an ASD device, an Amplatz ASD device, but the Amplatz PFO device is essentially the same device with some minor modifications. My objectives really here are to talk about reviewing some techniques, some tips, and some tricks for well-known, most commonly used general retrieval devices, but also to describe and demonstrate the use of a little-known, rarely used, very case-specific, but life-saving retrieval system that my junior partner got to know very well a couple of weeks ago. So this was an instance of a teenager who had an ASD device placed. She was watched overnight and was persistently tachycardic overnight, and in the morning they got this echocardiogram, and obviously the problem here is the device is embolized into the left atrium and is partially covering the mitral valve. My senior partner took this patient back to the lab, and the very first thing he did, which I think was a smart move, was to take a bioptome and to grab this device and pull it into the right atrium. It's a safer position for the device in case it does embolize further or in case any clots were to shower. There are some nice things about using a bioptome. It's simple, intuitive mechanics. It's readily available in labs, and it's very quick for controlling a loose foreign body. In general, however, it's not a device that I choose to use other than in this type of a situation of a free-floating device that could embolize out to the aorta at any moment. The reasons I don't particularly like it is it's not very easy to steer. When you do grab something, it's not a very firm grasp, so you may be able to grab it, but getting it into a sheath is going to be difficult without losing it. And obviously, this is designed to avulse material, a myocardium out of the heart. So if you're not exactly sure where you are pinching, you're going to take something that you don't want. At this point, he called me to help him out in the lab with the device sitting here now in the right atrium. So my go-to, and I think for most people who have lost devices repeatedly, the go-to is a gooseneck snare, and there really are great reasons for this. Again, it's readily available and fairly cheap. It's very steerable, particularly if you don't use the straight catheter that it comes with, but a directional catheter like a JR catheter. Once you have a hold of the foreign body, you can really hold on to this very tight, especially if you stretch the back end out and have someone use a hemostat to clamp the back end of the retrieval cord, and you're unlikely to harm any surrounding tissues. However, it is deceptively tricky in the mechanics, and I make our fellows really practice with these things sitting at their desk in their office, picking things up and putting them in other locations, because it's not quite as intuitive as it seems, and it does require practice. So my first tip here, my first pearl, is the intuition is, if I had a coffee cup on the edge of this podium that we're about to fall, the intuition is to grab this from the front from the closest possible place. In general, especially if the device is stable in its position, I think grabbing from the opposite side or extending the gooseneck beyond the foreign body and dragging it over is a good first step, and I'll show you what I mean by that. If we were to say that instead of using this clear tube, this were a vessel, and we pushed from the front but don't manage to grab it, we're just pushing this deeper and deeper into smaller and smaller vessels, and it may become harder to retrieve. My advice rather is to go past the device first and drag the loop over the foreign body. Tightening is similarly non-intuitive. The natural thing that people do once they finally, after a half hour of struggling to get this loop around the foreign body, is to pull the retrieval cord, and what you do there is just have to start all over again. The objective here is to try and keep the loop as close to its initial position as possible. So you're actually advancing the retrieval catheter and trying to then pull back just slightly on the cord in order to prevent the loop from really moving. So now we have a situation where we have a bioptome holding on to the device from the IVC. From the IJ, we have a gooseneck snare around the retrieval screw mechanism of the Amplatzer device. And from here, it should be easy, but for any of you who have spent any time fishing, you know that getting the fish on your line is not the end of the battle. And at this point, we ran into this common situation. We had the gooseneck snare around the around the screw mechanism, but could not get it into the catheter, into the sheath. And here, my advice is, as much as possible, when you're having a difficult time retrieving a device, get a hold of it, get control of it from more than one direction. And this is what I mean by that. If you're able to grab it from the opposite side, you can manipulate the device, and in this case, elongate it. The case I showed the fellows yesterday, you can actually change the conformation of a loop of coil, but either way, you have opportunities now to change the orientation, to elongate things, to make it more likely that you can retrieve the device out of the body. And in this case, it looks like a pretty good situation where we can just separate these and elongate the device, which we're able to partially do, but you can see here it still does not align properly to get into the sheath. And so we're interventionalists, right? If it's not working, just do it harder and it should work just fine. Well, in this case, we ended up completely collapsing the sheath. So what do we do at this point? Well, again, the more different places where we can hold on to this device, the more likely that we are to come up with a good solution. And so in this case, we still had the wire braid on the opposite end, and we're able to snare it separately. And at this point, it came into the sheath very well. This is the micro braid on the opposite end of the screw mechanism is much smaller and doesn't have that same problem with being able to go into the sheath. It's harder to grab, but not as much of a problem. All right, second verse, not quite as same as the first. This is a case of my junior partner, who's really fantastic, and she did a case the very first time that I went out of town, and she was on her own. This is a ductal occlusion device, but it's an Amplatzer device. The mechanics are exactly the same. She put the device in, did not like the way that it looked, and I think she was correct on that, and decided to recapture the device, but the delivery sheath imploded on itself. Essentially, it just collapsed in on itself. She was smart enough to try on her own the very things I just showed you. So she had this still attached to the original cable from below, and she thought if she snared from above, perhaps she could get the device in, and what she was able to do is to get the bottom half of the device in, but not the upper part. She decided to then pull it down into the IVC and hope that it would give her a better alignment of the device with the retrieval sheath, and it did not work. And at this point, she really wasn't sure what to do, and I'm going to explain what the problem is here.
It's not common, but sometimes a device may be deployed without being released, and a decision is made that you want to retract the device, either reposition it or remove it, but you can't. And that can happen, again, very rarely if the tip of the sheath starts to collapse on itself. And if that were to happen, the sheath would have to be removed in exchange for another sheath, and the question is, how do you do that? You can see what the problem is. Take a look over here, and if we say that the groin is right here, as you're exchanging with this cable, the cable isn't long enough to do the exchange. You can see we're run out of cable here, and the cable's not yet exposed in the groin here. So what do you do?
And this is a common problem when you get to this point, is that people don't know how to exchange the sheath. For those of you who deployed these devices, the cable isn't that long. And so There's one simple trick that gets you partway there, but not all the way.
Any of the cables for the ASD devices, the PFO devices, or the Amplatz duct occluder 1 of the Amplatzer devices can be used as an extension and an exchange cable. Every side here has the standard screw mechanism for attaching to a device, and on the other side is the female side that can receive the screw mechanism. So if we take a look at the cable, we've run out of room on the cable. The front end of a new cable can be added on so that the exchange can be completed.
So this is helpful, right? And a lot of people do know that the Amplatzer cables can screw into each other and become an exchange length cable. But here's the part where people then think they're out of the woods, but they're not, which is that the standard dilator that goes with the delivery sheets for these devices goes over an 038 wire, but these cables can go up to 0.088 in diameter. So you can't actually put the dilator and the sheath over the cable. And that's where one rarely used but very, very simple and important additional device is needed. And that's this. You look at here, we have two Amplatzer TorqueView sheaths, 45-degree angle, both of them 12 French, but there is a difference. Everyone carries the delivery systems, but not everyone carries the exchange systems. The only difference in these two packets is this. One has a dilator that goes over the standard 038. This is the delivery one for just delivering a device, and you can see that it has a much smaller internal diameter, whereas the exchange system can go all the way up to a 0.088 diameter. So the standard one, if you try and exchange, will not deliver a capture sheath.
So now we have gotten the exchange system, we've taken the extension cable and screwed it onto the back of the existing cable so that we could exchange out our faulty sheath. We've gotten the larger internal diameter dilator inside of the 12 French recovery sheath, which then just easily goes over, and now we should be able to retract the device that previously would not come back into the standard delivery sheath.
And it really is this simple at this point to get rid of it. And in fact, so at this point, my partner had called me, I told her what to do, and it was this easy. That's all it took. So my take-home messages are, try and get snares distal to the body that you're trying to retrieve, and consider grabbing objects from more than one direction. Be cognizant while attempting to retrieve things about vascular thrombosis and trauma that's possible. Assess vascular patency during and after retrieval and treat as appropriate, and stock and learn how to use device-specific rescue equipment. Finally, there are times where we think we have things handled, but we can get very quickly in over our heads. And what I would say about that is anytime you're going after a foreign body, I think it's important to give a call to your surgeon early in the game just so they know what's going on. Thanks very much.